On the evening when the family gathered to celebrate, my son leaned close to me, his voice cutting sharper than any knife at the table. "Don't talk business here, you'll embarrass me." The words fell heavy, as if the man I had raised now saw me not as a father, not even as a mentor, but as an intruder into the world he claimed as his own. The laughter around the table dimmed for a moment, then carried on, but for me, time stopped. I sat there, my fork resting untouched, watching the faces of my grandchildren as they exchanged quick, awkward glances, their lips twitching with the kind of nervous smiles that hide judgment. My daughter-in-law poured wine as though she had heard nothing, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction, as if my silence was a victory she had long awaited. And my son, my own blood, straightened his back, proud, as though silencing me was an achievement in itself. They did not know. None of them knew. Every bite of bread they lifted, every sip of wine they savored, every roof above their heads had been shaped by the hands they now forced into stillness. Years ago, when my son was young and unsure, he had come to me with trembling questions about money, about contracts, about trust. I taught him how to shake hands firmly, how to read numbers like a story, how to see opportunity where others saw failure. I had watched him learn, stumble, rise, and now, to the sound of clinking glasses and shallow conversation, he dared to tell me to remain invisible. I clenched my jaw, holding the fire inside. To answer him would have been too easy, too small. Instead, I chose silence. Not because I had nothing to say, but because my silence carried more weight than their laughter. My silence remembered nights when I worked until my hands bled, mornings when I left home before dawn to build a future my children would take for granted. My silence knew truths they had long forgotten, that every principle of business my son paraded before his clients, every ounce of wisdom he disguised as his own, had been born from my lessons. The meal carried on. Plates came and went, stories circled the table, but I was no longer part of them, at least not in their eyes. They had written me out, as though the man who had taught them how to dream was now an embarrassment to be hidden away. The bitterness burned, but beneath it was something else, something stronger, a calm certainty. I had given him everything, and he thought he could bury me beneath his pride. He thought he could silence me. But silence is not absence. Silence is patience, and patience, I knew, had a way of revealing truths that arrogance could never suppress. That night, as I rose from the table, pushing my chair back without a word, I carried not defeat, but dignity. My son could force my voice quiet for now. He could cut me off before his children, before his wife, before his clients. But one day soon, in a moment he least expected, the truth of who I was and what I had given would speak louder than anything he could say. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. He sat in silence long after the meal, but silence has a way of stirring memories. As the candles flickered low, his mind wandered back to the years when there was nothing but bare ground beneath his feet and determination in his chest. He remembered the mornings when he woke before the sun, his boots sinking into mud as he carried crates heavier than his body seemed capable of holding. No money in his pockets, no helping hand at his side, just hunger, grit, and the unshakable belief that if he worked harder than despair itself, life would eventually yield to him. The first office was not an office at all. It was a corner of a storage shed where the smell of oil and dust clung to every breath. He kept ledgers by candlelight, writing down numbers on crumpled paper, learning to balance failure with the same care as profit. Every setback was a lesson. Every closed door forced him to build another way in. He had no investors, no inheritance, no shortcuts, only the raw determination that the name he carried would one day stand for something more than struggle. And when his son was born, those lessons became more than survival. They became teachings. The boy had sat on his lap while he traced figures on old notebooks, wide-eyed as his father explained how every number was a story, how every signature was a promise. He had grown up watching contracts drafted by hands blistered from labor, watching his father shake hands not with arrogance, but with the steady dignity of a man whose word was iron. Those were not classroom lectures. They were truths carved into bone, carried through sweat and sacrifice. Yet now, one dismissive glance, one sharp command at the dinner table, had swept it all aside. As though those years of hunger had never been lived, as though the principles he bled for were worthless relics, too old to be spoken of in the presence of polished shoes and expensive wine. The pain was not just in the rejection, it was in the erasure. The very man who owed his standing, his reputation, his success to those lessons now acted as though they had never existed. Still, memory would not be silenced. He could still see the boy who once followed him to work sites, asking endless questions about trust, risk, and courage. He could still recall the nights when that boy, trembling with fear over his first failed deal, came to him for guidance, and the father placed a steady hand on his shoulder and whispered the truth, that failure was not death, that every fall was a chance to rise stronger. Those were the foundations, the unshakable ground beneath his son's pride, and yet now they were hidden, buried under arrogance. The father did not resent the success. No, he had wanted it, prayed for it, sacrificed for it. What wounded him was the denial, the rewriting of history, the cruel insistence that he had never mattered. It was as if the very stones he had laid were now mocked by the house they supported. And yet, beneath the sting, there was also a quiet certainty. He knew the truth, that roots cannot be erased by the branches that grow above them. The tree may deny the soil, but the soil remembers. And the day would come when his son would be reminded of those roots, not by his father's voice, but by life itself. The evening was already heavy with unspoken tension when the door opened, and a new presence filled the room. It was the client, the man everyone had been waiting for, dressed in a suit that carried the weight of influence, his every step measured and deliberate. Conversation hushed for a moment, then erupted again with renewed energy. Glasses were lifted, voices brightened, and suddenly the atmosphere was charged with the electricity of opportunity. The family shifted, eager to impress, eager to be seen as part of something larger than themselves. And at the center of it stood the son, straight-backed, polished, radiating pride as if the room itself belonged to him. The father watched from his quiet place at the edge of the table. He knew that look on his son's face, the way his shoulders squared, the way he leaned in with crafted charm. It was the same posture he himself had worn years ago when trying to win the trust of men who doubted him. He had taught his son how to meet another's eyes with steadiness, how to speak with confidence, even when fear gnawed at the heart, how to listen for the needs buried beneath words. And now, those very lessons played out before him, though the credit was taken by another, stolen in silence. The son laughed with his client, pouring wine as though it were a symbol of his own success. He spoke of ventures and strategies, his words polished, rehearsed. The room admired him. The family glowed with reflected pride. They did not see the invisible scaffolding holding him up, the foundation laid brick by the man they kept in the shadows. Every sentence he spoke was dressed in the garments of another man's wisdom, yet no one acknowledged it. To them, it was his brilliance alone. The client nodded with approval, and the son's pride swelled. He gestured toward the walls, the furniture, the table heavy with food as though they were his trophies, his proof that he had ascended to the heights he deserved. But the father knew better. Each of those triumphs was not born in this polished room. They had their roots in sweat-soaked shirts, in blistered hands, in long nights counting coins by lamplight. The sun stood tall on a mountain, but the stones of that mountain had been laid by the man now treated as irrelevant. It stung, that invisibility. It burned in the father's chest like a slow fire. He had not come to boast, nor to claim what was his, but to see his family, to share their table, and yet the irony was unbearable. The very client who now praised his son's composure, his business sense, his apparent mastery, those qualities were not his own inventions. They were inherited, molded, given freely by the father who now sat ignored, as though he had never existed. And still, the father remained composed. He let the scene unfold, watching pride dance across his son's face, watching the room intoxicated by the illusion of success. He did not speak, for he did not need to. The truth has its own way of surfacing, its own time to rise. Pride can only cover roots for so long before the soil itself begins to speak. The client's presence lit the evening, but beneath the glow, the father saw something deeper, an inevitability. For the way the man's eyes occasionally drifted, searching as though recognizing something familiar, suggested that pride's mask would not hold forever. The son basked in glory, blind to the truth that his confidence, his strength, his very ability to stand in this room came from another man's sacrifice. The father knew this with the certainty of time itself. And he also knew that before the night ended, the ground beneath his son's pride would tremble. The father sat in the corner, the hum of voices swirling around him like smoke, thick and suffocating. Laughter rose and fell as numbers were tossed about like trophies, deals described in broad strokes meant to impress. The son leaned forward with polished ease, recounting strategies, explaining principles, presenting them as if they were sparks struck from his own brilliance. The room absorbed his every word, nodding in admiration, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, that these sparks had once been lit by another man's fire. Every phrase pierced the father, not because it was wrong, but because it was achingly familiar. He had spoken those same lessons decades earlier, not in grand halls or at glittering tables, but in the dim light of modest rooms where failure pressed in on every side. He remembered explaining to his son how every business was not built on numbers alone, but on trust, that a deal without honor was poison no matter the profit. He remembered teaching him that patience outlives aggression, that listening was often the sharpest weapon in negotiation. He remembered sitting beside him, showing him how to shake hands with dignity, how to never make promises his heart could not keep. Now, hearing those same words in his son's mouth, dressed in the arrogance of ownership, felt like betrayal layered with silence. The son spoke of patience as though it were his own discovery. He described trust as though he had carved it from stone. He paraded cautionary tales that he had never lived, borrowing his father's scars but polishing them into stories of his own wisdom. And no one questioned it. No one asked where these lessons had come from, who had planted them, who had watered them with sweat and sacrifice. The father's chest tightened with each boast. He was not jealous of the success. He had prayed for it, sacrificed for it, bled for it. What struck him with the sharpest pain was the erasure, the deliberate silence that covered his name. To claim knowledge without honoring its source was more than pride. It was theft of memory itself. His son had become the man he once dreamed he would be, but in the process had cut away the roots that had nourished him. And yet as the father sat there in the shadow, he saw something the others did not. Behind the smooth delivery, beneath the polished exterior, his son's words trembled ever so slightly with the same insecurity he once held as a boy. It was hidden well, masked by laughter and wine, but the father recognized it instantly. His son was still leaning on him even now, though he would never admit it. The foundation could be denied, but it could not be erased. The roots might be buried deep, but they continued to feed the branches that reached for the sky. In that moment, the father felt a strange calm wash over him. The silence he carried was no longer just a wound, but a form of justice. For he knew the truth. Principles cannot be stolen, only borrowed. And one day, the weight of unacknowledged lessons would press down too heavily to bear. His son might hide their origin tonight, but life had a way of peeling back masks, of forcing truth to step into the light. He sat back, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. The room might see only a quiet old man at the edge of the table, irrelevant and forgotten. But within him, he carried the unshakable knowledge that every success they toasted, every victory they admired, bore his invisible fingerprints. His silence was not defeat, it was a mirror, waiting for the day when pride itself would be forced to look and recognize the reflection staring back. The evening pressed on, the laughter growing louder, the pride in the son's voice swelling with every compliment he received. But beneath the music of glass and silverware there came a moment when his mask slipped, when his need to control the stage outweighed even the pretense of respect. He turned to his father, his tone low but sharp enough to cut through the noise around them. "Please, just don't interfere." The words hung in the air like a sentence handed down in a courtroom. Not advice, not a request, but a command. They carried with them a weight far heavier than the moment deserved, for in them lay an entire history dismissed in a single breath. The father's chest tightened, his jaw stiffened, and beneath the table, his hands curled into fists against the wood. He did not raise his eyes to meet his son's, not because he lacked the strength, but because he felt the crushing pain of rejection more deeply than any wound he had endured in the years of struggle. His own flesh and blood, the boy he had carried on his shoulders through storms of failure, now pushed him aside, as though his presence itself were shameful. He sat perfectly still, but inside him memories raged like fire. He saw himself kneeling on cracked floors, counting the last of his coins while his son slept soundly in the next room, dreaming in a bed his father's hands had built. He saw himself standing in the cold of early mornings, pressing contracts against damp wooden tables, praying that one signature would keep food on the table. He remembered his son's questions late at night, about courage, about fear, about what it meant to be a man in a world that devoured the weak. And he remembered answering each one with patience, with honesty, with love, even when his own spirit was breaking. And now, those years were erased with a single remark: "Don't interfere." As though his wisdom was poison, as though his voice was a burden too heavy for his son's pride to bear. The father felt the heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. To speak now would be to give the insult more power. To argue would only feed the arrogance sitting across from him. And so he held his silence, not because he had nothing left to say, but because his silence carried a dignity that could not be stripped from him, no matter how cruelly he was dismissed. The room carried on, oblivious. The family smiled. The client listened. The son continued his performance. But inside, the father felt the sharp edges of betrayal. He had given his son not just lessons in business, but lessons in loyalty, in respect, in humility. To see them twisted, ignored, and thrown back in his face was a wound deeper than failure. He could accept the world's rejection, but to be cast aside by his own blood was something else entirely. Still, beneath the pain, a strange clarity began to take shape. For every word his son spoke, every story he twisted into his own, carried an echo of the father's voice. The world could be fooled, but the father knew the truth. The son's arrogance was built on borrowed stone, his pride resting on a foundation he had not laid himself. And though he tried to silence the man who had given him everything, there would come a moment when silence would no longer protect him. The truth had a way of rising, uninvited, unshakable, undeniable. The father unclenched his hands beneath the table, his nails leaving marks in his palms. He breathed slowly, letting the weight of the insult settle deep inside him, not as defeat, but as proof. Proof that pride blinds even those we love. Proof that ingratitude sharpens its knives most cruelly at the hands that fed it. And though his son thought he had silenced him, the father knew the story was not finished. The lesson was not over. Pride had spoken its sentence, but justice would have the final word. The son spoke with the confidence of a man convinced the room belonged to him, his words polished, his gestures deliberate. The family laughed at his jokes, nodded at his statements, and the client, at first, seemed to play along. Yet as the evening stretched on, a subtle shift began to ripple through the air, one that only the father noticed. The client's eyes, sharp and searching, wandered from the glowing sun to the quiet figure seated further down the table. They lingered there, not briefly, not by accident, but with the weight of recognition, as though drawn to a truth beneath the surface. The father felt the gaze before he dared to meet it. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he raised his eyes, and when he did, he found not the polite indifference one often spares for the elderly, but something deeper: respect, warmth, a spark of familiarity, as though the man across the table was not looking at a forgotten relic, but at the very roots of something he himself valued. The client's lips did not move, but his eyes spoke volumes. "I know who you are, even if they pretend not to." For the first time that evening, the father felt the iron grip around his chest loosen just slightly. He had sat through insult, through erasure, through the pain of his own son's dismissal. But here, in the quiet acknowledgement of a stranger, was a reminder that truth has a way of showing itself. His son could silence him, his family could look past him, but he could not be erased from the eyes of those who recognized depth when they saw it. Memories stirred within the client's gaze, though unspoken, the father sensed them. Perhaps this man, too, had once been a student of hardship. Perhaps he had, at some point in his journey, crossed paths with the lessons that the father had planted in younger men. Perhaps he had seen his writings, heard his teachings second-hand, or felt the ripple of wisdom that had traveled far beyond the walls of this house. Whatever the reason, the recognition was undeniable. The son, basking in his moment, did not notice. He leaned closer to his client, listing achievements as though reading from a scroll of victories, unaware that the man he sought to impress was no longer truly listening. The client nodded occasionally, but his eyes returned again and again to the father, as though measuring him, as though quietly acknowledging the deeper current beneath the performance. The father lowered his gaze once more, not out of shame but out of humility. He did not crave the recognition, yet its presence stirred something within him, a quiet vindication, a reminder that the world is not blind, no matter how much pride attempts to cover its eyes. His silence, once a cloak of sorrow, now felt like a shield. He had endured the cutting remark, the dismissal, the theft of his own voice, but now, in the eyes of the client, he saw a reflection of his true worth. He breathed slowly, feeling the weight of the years settle differently upon him, no longer as chains of invisibility, but as the solid armor of a life lived with honor, with perseverance, with truth that could not be erased by arrogance. The client's glance was brief, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but for the father it was enough to remind him that even in silence his legacy spoke, enough to remind him that dignity does not require applause, enough to assure him that though his son's voice might dominate the room, it was not the only voice that mattered. The night went on, the wine flowed, the laughter rose, but beneath it all, a quiet thread of recognition bound the old man and the client together. And though no one else at the table could see it, the father knew. Truth was already stirring, waiting for its moment to rise. The conversation turned, as it always does among men who measure themselves by numbers, toward the past, the foundations of their successes, the strategies that had carried them through lean years into harvest. The son leaned in eagerly, his voice full of authority, recounting principles as though he had carved them from stone. He spoke of patience over haste, of loyalty over greed, of the power of a reputation kept clean, even when profit tempted otherwise. The room nodded along, and he basked in their admiration. Every word a polished stone he stacked into a monument for himself. But then, without warning, the client's expression shifted. A half smile crossed his face, the kind not born of politeness, but of memory. He leaned back slightly, his glass turning in his hand, and with a soft laugh he said, almost absent-mindedly, "You know, I once studied those very methods. They shaped my whole career." The words hung in the air, unnoticed by most, but they cut like a blade through the father's chest. Not for pain this time, but for recognition. The client's gaze did not linger on the son. It moved, as though pulled by something stronger than intention, and rested on the quiet figure seated apart. The father felt the weight of those eyes again, steady and knowing, and in that silent moment truth began to tremble beneath the surface of pride. The client's words were not a performance. They carried sincerity, gratitude, the echo of a man recalling the wisdom that had steadied him in storms long past. And though he had not spoken the father's name, his eyes made it clear who he credited. The son's smile faltered, just slightly. A flicker of unease crossed his face, quickly masked by another boast, another polished phrase. But the father saw it. He saw the tightening of his son's jaw, the shift in his posture, the way his hand gripped the glass just a little too tightly. He knew what it meant. His son had heard the truth in those words, had recognized the danger of being unmasked, had realized that the man he had silenced was no longer invisible. For the father, the moment was almost unbearable in its quiet power. He did not need applause, nor acknowledgement, nor even words. That single glance from the client was enough to breathe life back into every sacrifice, every lesson, every sleepless night of toil. It was as though the universe itself had bent for an instant to whisper, "You were not forgotten. Your work mattered. Your legacy lives." The table buzzed on. The laughter resumed. The son tried to redirect the flow of conversation. But beneath the noise, the father sat rooted in something unshakable. His son could not erase him, not when his teachings lived on in the very men he sought to impress. The recognition might have been brief, unspoken, but it carried more weight than all the hollow applause the son had gathered that night. And as the client's eyes returned once more to the father, steady and respectful, the old man felt no need to lower his gaze this time. He held it, calm and unwavering, not with pride, but with quiet dignity. He had been silenced, dismissed, erased, but here was proof that truth cannot be buried. His voice lived on, even when he did not speak. His legacy had already outgrown the shadows, waiting patiently to step into the light. The son's laughter rang out a second too late. His smile stretched thin, a fragile mask against the weight of truth creeping into the room. He adjusted his tie, tugged at the knot as though the silk itself was strangling him. His polished voice, so smooth only moments before, now caught in his throat, words tumbling less freely, each sentence dragged out as if forcing the conversation away from dangerous ground. But the current had shifted, and he felt it. Everyone at the table might still be charmed by his performance, but he knew, that the client's words carried a thread that led elsewhere, back to roots he had worked so hard to sever. His mind raced, trying to bury the unease, but memory is a cruel betrayer. For every principle he claimed as his own, he heard his father's voice echoing behind it, not loud, but steady, unyielding. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a boy, watching his father draw diagrams on scraps of paper, turning complex matters into simple truths. He remembered listening to stories of lost deals and hard-won victories, lessons wrapped not in theory, but in scars. And though he had long since painted those lessons over with his own colors, now the undercoat of truth began to show through, and the recognition in the client's eyes told him it could no longer be hidden. His heart pounded beneath the tailored suit, and suddenly the room felt smaller. The client's words replayed again and again, each time pulling at the threads of the tapestry he had woven around himself. He feared that with one more question, one more pointed glance, the illusion would unravel completely. His success, so carefully polished, so publicly displayed, was not a monument to his independence, but a reflection of another man's foundation. And though he had tried to bury that truth, bury it under wealth and arrogance, tonight it clawed its way back into the light. The father sat silently, but silence had become heavier than speech. Every moment of restraint, every quiet breath, seemed to press against the son like judgment. It was not accusation, not reproach, but something far worse, an unshaken dignity that made his own arrogance look small. The more the father remained still, the more the son's composure cracked. He tugged again at his tie, forced another smile, but the laughter in his eyes had gone out. He knew what was coming. Perhaps not tonight, perhaps not in words spoken aloud, but the truth was no longer his to control. It was in the client's glance, in the unspoken recognition around the table, in the very presence of the man he had tried to silence. The son had built his life on borrowed wisdom, convinced he could claim it as his own. But now, in the presence of the one who had given him everything, the weight of his deception pressed against him like a stone on his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like the boy who had once sat trembling, asking for advice he pretended not to need. And though he fought to keep his voice steady, though he smiled and gestured as though nothing had shifted, inside he trembled with the knowledge that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. The truth was breaking through, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The room was alive with the hum of voices and clinking glasses, yet beneath the noise an unseen current built with every passing moment. The sun pressed on, his words hurried now, as if speed could shield him from the shadow creeping closer. He gestured grandly, spoke of strategies, of principles, of victories, desperate to drown out the client's lingering glance toward his father. But truth is patient. It does not vanish simply because pride wishes it away. And then it happened. The client rose from his seat, his chair scraping against the polished floor, and all conversation faltered. He did not look at the son, though the son angled his body toward him expectantly, waiting for the praise he thought he had earned. Instead, the client turned, his gaze steady, his steps deliberate, until his eyes met the quiet figure at the far end of the table. And then, with a gravity that silenced even the laughter of children in the next room, he bowed his head. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying not just formality but reverence, "I must thank you. It was your teachings, your principles that guided me when I first started. Without you, I would not be standing here today." The words struck like thunder in a cloudless sky. Forks froze midair. Wine glasses trembled in unsteady hands. The family who moments ago had basked in the glow of the son's performance now sat still, their eyes darting between the client and the man they had dismissed as irrelevant. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses against the chest and refuses to let breath come easily. The father did not move. He did not rise, did not reach for recognition. He simply sat, his weathered hands resting quietly on the table, his gaze soft but unyielding. Inside, however, a storm raged, a storm of memories, of nights spent teaching, of sacrifices long forgotten by those who benefited most. And now, at last, someone had spoken what his own family had tried so hard to erase, that his wisdom mattered, that his life had carved paths for others, that he was not a burden, but a foundation. The son's face drained of color. His tie, once a symbol of authority, now seemed a noose tightening around his throat. He shifted in his chair, tried to force a smile, but the mask slipped too far this time. The truth had been spoken aloud, undeniable, and it had not come from his lips but from the very man he sought to impress. He glanced toward his father, but the old man did not look at him. That absence of acknowledgment cut deeper than any reprimand could have. The daughter-in-law lowered her gaze, suddenly fascinated by the untouched food on her plate. The grandchildren, sensing the shift even without understanding the words, sat frozen, the laughter gone from their young eyes. The entire room felt as though it had been turned inside out. Its center of gravity shifted from the son to the man he had tried to silence. And in that stillness, the father felt something he had not felt in years. Not triumph, not vindication, but a quiet, aching relief. For he had never needed the world's applause. He had only needed the truth to be spoken, even once, even by a single voice with the courage to acknowledge it. And now, as the client's bowed head lingered in reverence, he knew the silence had ended. His legacy had stepped into the light, not through his own defense, but through the undeniable gratitude of another. The room remained hushed, as though every wall, every flicker of candlelight, bore witness to this revelation. And though the father did not speak, the truth thundered louder than any words ever could. All at once, as though pulled by an invisible thread, every head at the table turned. Their eyes, moments earlier fixed on the son in admiration, now rested on the quiet figure at the end of the table. The weight of that collective gaze was heavier than stone, but the father bore it with the same composure that had carried him through decades of hardship. He did not flinch, did not rise to meet it, did not demand their attention. He simply sat, steady and still, while the silence swelled into something vast and undeniable. The son froze. His hand, gripping the stem of his glass, trembled so slightly it betrayed him. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, collapsed inward as though the floor itself had shifted beneath his chair. For years he had built a mask, polished, convincing, crafted from arrogance and denial. He had worn it to clients, to friends, to his own family, until he almost believed it himself. But now, with a single acknowledgement from the client, that mask cracked, and beneath it lay the truth he had tried so hard to bury. He was not a man who had risen alone. He was not a self-made giant. He was the son of the very man he had silenced, the student of the teacher he had cast aside. The family sat stunned. The daughter-in-law, who had often smiled with thinly veiled contempt, pressed her lips together, her face paling with discomfort. The grandchildren, once restless and laughing, now stared at their grandfather with wide eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. Even the walls of the house seemed to hold their breath, as though the very foundation recognized the man who had built more than walls and roofs. He had built lives, futures, legacies. The son's mouth opened, but no words came. What excuse could he give? What justification could he find? To claim ignorance would be a lie too shallow to stand. To claim credit would be impossible now, exposed under the harsh light of truth. He was left with nothing but silence, and in that silence, his father's dignity spoke louder than anything he could offer. The father, meanwhile, did not gloat. He did not smile in triumph, nor did he scold with bitter satisfaction. His eyes remained calm, his hands folded gently in his lap, as though this moment had always belonged to time itself, not to his will. He knew that truth, when it finally arrives, does not need to shout. It is enough that it stands. And tonight it stood taller than pride, taller than pretense, taller than the lies woven over years of denial. For the son, it was suffocation. The mask he had worn so long was gone, and all that remained was the raw, trembling boy who once sat at his father's side, desperate for guidance. He felt stripped bare, not just before his client, but before his family, his children, his wife. They saw him now, not as the towering figure he wanted to be, but as a man diminished by ingratitude, exposed by the very truth he tried to hide. The silence deepened, heavy with shame, heavy with revelation. It was not the father's voice that filled the room, but the echo of everything he had given, everything he had sacrificed, everything that could no longer be erased. And though no verdict was spoken, it was clear to all. The illusion had ended, the mask had fallen, and in its place only truth remained, sharper and more enduring than any lie. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, suffocating, and alive with shame. Moments earlier, the room had been filled with the clink of glasses and the hum of laughter, but now every sound seemed to have fled, leaving behind a stillness that pressed on every chest. The grandchildren, who had giggled at their father's stories and whispered behind their hands, no longer dared to meet their grandfather's eyes. Their innocence had been pierced by something they did not fully understand, but felt in their bones, that they had been laughing in the wrong direction, mocking a man whose quiet presence carried more weight than all the boasting in the room. The wife, who so often sat with a proud tilt of her chin, lowered her gaze to her plate, as if the food she had ignored all evening suddenly required her full attention. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but she did not drink. The mask she had worn, the mask of superiority, of alignment with her husband's arrogance, cracked under the unbearable weight of truth. She could not bring herself to look at the man who had built the very foundation of their lives, the man she had silently dismissed as unnecessary. To meet his eyes now would have meant confronting her own complicity, and she was not ready for that. Around the table, cousins, aunts, and distant relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their laughter had once been an echo chamber for the son's arrogance, a chorus that reinforced his illusions. But now, stripped of that mask, they found themselves staring at the hollow space where pride had stood, and the reflection of their own silence haunted them. They had known, deep down, that the old man's absence in their conversations was unnatural. They had felt the imbalance when his contributions were dismissed, when his stories were cut short, when his name was left out of victories he had helped to shape. Yet they had gone along with it, choosing comfort over truth. And now, the shame of that choice burned in the hollow silence. The father did not move. His stillness was not weakness, but a mirror. He sat with his hands resting gently on the table, his shoulders straight, his face calm. He did not need to speak. The silence was already speaking for him. It carried every sacrifice he had made, every lesson he had given, every moment of his life that had been ignored until now. The quiet dignity in his presence pressed harder on their hearts than any reprimand could have. The son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his breath shallow, his face pale. The silence wrapped around him like chains, pulling him down into the weight of his own choices. He looked at his children, at his wife, at his relatives, and saw their eyes avoiding him. He looked at his client and saw not admiration, but recognition of another man's greatness. The success he had claimed, the independence he had flaunted, the pride he had brandished like a sword, all of it seemed brittle now, cracked and ready to collapse under the gravity of truth. And so the silence grew, heavier with each passing second. It was no longer simply the absence of sound. It was the sound of regret, the regret of those who realized they had looked down upon a man who had lifted them higher than they ever could have risen alone. It was the regret of a son who had tried to bury his father's legacy beneath his own pride, only to find that legacy shining brighter than his own shadow. It was the regret of a family that suddenly saw the truth. They had mocked the very man whose name and work still carried them. No words could break that silence. No apology, no excuse, no frantic attempt to explain would have been enough. The truth had spoken, and in its echo, regret filled the room like a flood, drowning every trace of arrogance that had once lived there. And the old man, sitting quietly with eyes that held neither fury nor pity, became in that moment not just the father, not just the elder, but the undeniable weight of history and truth they could never erase. The silence had settled like a heavy fog. Yet in its stillness, the father became larger than he had ever seemed before. He did not clear his throat to seize attention, nor did he rise from his seat to claim what was already his by right. He remained still, his back straight, his face calm, his hands folded with the quiet strength of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. There was no trembling in his fingers, no bitterness in his eyes, and though his lips did not move, his very presence spoke louder than thunder. The son, watching him, felt his stomach twist with unease. He had always imagined his father's silence to be weakness, the silence of a man too old, too tired, too irrelevant to argue. But now he saw it differently. That silence was not surrender. It was power. It was the kind of power that did not demand, did not beg, did not lash out in fury, but simply stood unbroken. The son's words, his boasts, his sharp commands, all of them seemed pitiful in comparison to the unshaken dignity that radiated from the man at the end of the table. The father did not remind them of the nights he had sacrificed sleep so his children would not go hungry. He did not recall the contracts he had fought to win, the debts he had paid with his own sweat, the lessons he had carved into his son's life. He did not remind them of the roof they lived under, or the ground that bore their weight, or the principles that had become their invisible armor. He did not need to, for in that silence, every sacrifice screamed louder than words. Every scar, every wrinkle, every gray hair testified for him. His life itself had become the argument, and it was undeniable. Around the table, eyes lowered. The grandchildren, sensing something they could not name, stared at their grandfather as though he carried a crown invisible to all but truth. The daughter-in-law, once quick with sharp glances, now dared not look up at him. Even the client, who had already given his gratitude, leaned back in quiet reverence, as if not to disturb the weight of what stood unspoken. The son's chest tightened. He tried to form words, to summon explanations, but they died on his tongue. What could he say in the face of such composure? His father had no need to accuse him, no need to cry out against the betrayal. That calm, unyielding silence told him more than 1,000 reproaches ever could. You know the truth. You have always known it, and it will not be erased. The son's pride crumbled, piece by piece. For the first time, he saw that the true strength had never been in the loudness of voices, in the brilliance of performance, or in the applause of others. It was here, in this quiet resilience, in the stillness of a man who had endured humiliation without surrendering his dignity. The father did not need fury to command the room. He had already won through patience, through endurance, through the unshakable certainty of who he was. The weight of that realization crushed the son in a way no anger could have. Fury would have given him something to fight against, an excuse to resist, but dignity left him defenseless. The quiet grace of the father's composure left no room for denial, no shield to hide behind. It revealed him for what he was, not the independent titan he pretended to be, but a man standing on the foundation built by another. And so the father sat in silence, his face calm, his heart steady, his dignity shining brighter than pride ever could. He had been dismissed, silenced, betrayed, but he had not broken. And now, in the gaze of every soul in that room, his unspoken strength stood taller than their shame, undeniable and unerasable. The son opened his mouth, but no sound came at first. His lips moved, his throat strained, and finally, broken words stumbled out, half-formed apologies, excuses wrapped in stammering breaths. Yet every syllable fell flat, hollow and weightless against the gravity of what had just unfolded. His voice, once sharp and commanding, now trembled like glass on the verge of shattering. He tried to speak of respect, of gratitude, but the words rang false, stripped of substance, because everyone in the room knew he had spent years doing the opposite. His pride, once towering, collapsed like a house built on sand. He felt it crumbling beneath him, the applause he had depended on slipping away, the admiration in the client's eyes no longer his to claim. The family's silence was heavier than accusation, and the man at the far end of the table, his father, the one he had silenced, diminished, dismissed, sat calm and steady, his very stillness a judgment too vast to escape. The son's heart pounded with desperation. He searched for words that could rebuild what arrogance had destroyed, but there were none. Gratitude had been spoken, but not to him. Respect had been shown, but not for him. The man he had cast into the shadows now stood brighter than he ever had, without moving, without speaking, simply by being revealed for who he always was. And the son, once so certain of his dominance, was left small, exposed, and trembling in the ruins of his own pride. The father did not rise to claim the moment, nor did he lift his voice to make the silence heavier than it already was. He simply turned his eyes toward the client, meeting the man's gaze with the calm assurance of someone who has nothing left to prove. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he gave a nod. It was not a gesture of triumph, not a declaration of victory, but an acknowledgement, quiet, steady, and profound. The seeds he had planted long ago had borne fruit, and tonight that fruit had spoken for itself. The client returned the look with reverence, his gratitude clear without another word. In that exchange, the room witnessed something greater than any speech or defense. The father's justice had arrived, not with fury, not with vengeance, but with truth. Truth carried not by his own tongue, but by the voice of another who had received, cherished, and honored his teachings. It was justice without anger, dignity without demand. The son sat frozen, his world unraveling. He had expected that, if ever his father rose against him, it would be with words, with accusations, with the sting of resentment. But there was no fury here, no bitter reproach, and that absence was more devastating than rage could ever be. Rage can be argued with, resisted, even despised, but silence filled with dignity leaves no space to hide. The family shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their shame pressing down heavier than any punishment. They saw now what had been invisible to them for so long. They saw a man who had never needed applause to know his worth, a man whose greatest legacy was not wealth or power, but wisdom that had outlived denial. They saw justice not as fire but as light, illuminating everything that had been hidden in the shadows. The father lowered his gaze once more, his composure unshaken, his heart at peace. He did not need to claim the moment, because the moment had already claimed him. His justice was complete, not because he had demanded recognition, but because truth had found its way to the surface, undeniable and unerasable. And in that quiet victory, the room understood. There is no strength greater than dignity, no justice sharper than truth revealed without fury. From that evening forward, something in the air around his name changed. It was no longer spoken carelessly, no longer whispered as though he were a relic better left in silence. It carried weight, the kind of weight that bends heads and straightens spines, because it had finally been revealed for what it was. Not the name of a man forgotten, but of a man whose wisdom had shaped lives in ways pride could not erase. Even in the quiet halls of the house, even in the glances exchanged between family members who once mocked him, there was a new reverence, reluctant perhaps, but unshakable. The truth had been spoken aloud, and truth cannot be buried again. The son, once drunk on his own independence, now walked differently. His steps, once bold and careless, became hesitant, heavier with the knowledge of what he had denied. He understood at last that his father's true legacy was not measured in contracts, in profits, in polished handshakes under chandeliers. It was in the raw, unpolished lessons that had once been handed down to him like seeds. Lessons about patience when all else failed, about courage in the face of scarcity, about loyalty when betrayal was easy, about building not just businesses but character. He realized that everything he had stood upon, his reputation, his strategies, his confidence, had been scaffolding borrowed from his father's labor. And though he had once tried to claim it as his own, the world had now seen through the disguise. In the days that followed, the grandchildren looked at the grandfather differently. They no longer saw only an aging man who sat in silence at the edge of the table. They whispered less and listened more, sensing that within his quiet eyes lay answers their parents could not give. The daughter-in-law avoided his gaze at first, ashamed of the contempt she had carried, but even she could not deny the shift. His presence, once treated as a shadow, now filled the room with a gravity that could not be ignored. And the father himself? He did not change. because he had never needed to. He did not boast of the vindication, did not remind them of the cruel words they had spoken, did not demand apologies that would only cheapen the moment. He remained who he always was, a man of dignity, a man of patience, a man who understood that real legacy does not come from recognition, but from endurance. He had given his son more than wealth, more than opportunity. He had given him the invisible tools to survive in a world that devours the unprepared. And now those tools, though unacknowledged for so long, had been seen and named for what they were. The son carried the burden of regret, but within it was also a quiet seed of understanding. He knew now that the greatest inheritance he had received was not money, not land, not status, but the lessons carved into him by his father's sacrifice. And though he could not undo the years of arrogance, he could never again deny the truth. The knowledge was his curse, but also his salvation. To recognize that he had been shaped by a man he had cast aside, and that no pride could ever erase that truth. As the seasons turned and the years moved on, the father's name grew beyond the walls of his family. Among clients, colleagues, and those who had once crossed paths with him, it became a symbol of resilience, of wisdom tested in the fire of hardship, of dignity that cannot be bought or destroyed. His lessons lived not in the pages of books or in the signatures of contracts, but in the lives of those who had absorbed them, carried them, and passed them on again. They traveled quietly, like seeds scattered by the wind, germinating in places he would never see, blooming in futures far beyond his reach. And so his legacy became eternal. Not in monuments or in wealth counted by heirs, but in the invisible architecture of truth he had built in the world. A legacy deeper than betrayal, stronger than shame, louder than silence. A legacy that no rejection, no cruelty, no pride could erase. The son finally understood this, and though the knowledge burned, it was undeniable. His father's teachings were not just his past. They were the very ground upon which his own life stood. And long after the father's voice had gone quiet, long after his chair at the table sat empty, his lessons would continue to speak, unerasable, indestructible, eternal.